Should we share our Aadhaar details or should we not? Can we give a photocopy of our Aadhaar if anybody asks for identification purposes, or should we not? And where can we share it? Where should we not? All of these questions, if you didn't have these questions up until now, I'm pretty sure after the massive controversy over the last 48 hours, you are definitely thinking about it. Now let's just recap, in case you haven't heard it, what just happened over the last couple of days, over the weekend actually. Well, there was a press release of UIDAI that was put out on May 27th. Now this press release was essentially a public warning. It was warning people about the photocopies of Aadhaar, telling them that they should not share the Aadhaar photocopy with anybody because it could lead to possible misuse. This press release went on to say that in case somebody does ask you for your identification and Aadhaar for some of the other kind of verification, you should use your masked Aadhaar copy. This is actually masked Aadhaar copies where all of the digits are not visible, only the last 4 digits are visible. And so it says if you really need to share it, then this is the one you should share. The advisory then went on to say that people need to be alert about the possible misuse. They also said that this is being issued in public interest, and it was then put out on PIB. Obviously, it triggered off a lot of concern because so far we've been talking about how Aadhaar can be used everywhere. We've been told that just putting that 12-digit number out there in public domain along with your name and address is not a big security threat. It is not a big privacy threat. That Aadhaar and UIDAI has multiple levels of verification, and without which nothing, no data of yours can be stolen and no privacy invaded. But here was the UIDAI telling us that hotels and other private entities who ask you for your Aadhaar details cannot really do so, that they are not, unless they are a licensed user registration entity, they're not allowed to ask for these details, and you don't have to share these details. So a lot of confusion, a lot of concern really came about. Soon after, we saw a clarification being issued, which frankly for me added to the confusion, because this clarification in a sense only said that we are withdrawing this press release. It said that the statement was issued by the Bengaluru UIDAI office, the regional office, and it was issued in context to queries about whether photocopies of Aadhaar can be misused, and which is why the statement was issued, but it can be misinterpreted, so we are withdrawing it. Rest assured, there is enough safety features built in within the system to protect your information. It still didn't explain to us whether or not we should share photocopies or not. If there was actually a concern of misuse, how does that suddenly go away just because you've withdrawn this press statement? That question never really did get answered. So we thought, let's bring in experts. Let's bring in 2 big experts who've tracked everything related to Aadhaar very closely since the system was created, who've repeatedly spoken about multiple issues, have listened and heard and looked into every claim that was made by the Aadhaar authority or by the government itself. Now, the questions that I'm actually going to be asking them or seeking answers to is, so what is the final decision? Can we share the photocopy of our Aadhaar with people, with schools and colleges and reservations and airlines and hotels, your society clubs, or anybody else who's asking us for ID verification? Can we share this photocopy or not? Then we will ask the question, how does sharing a masked Aadhaar copy help avoid misuse? If that's the solution, how? Let's try and understand what happens there and what level of protection comes in. Then we will obviously ask this question that UIDAI in its first notice said that you need to see if the entity who's asking you for Aadhaar details does have a user license. Now, how do I check that? do I know, are there certain banks, NBFCs, payment entities who have this permission, but certain others who don't have this permission? Is it a list? Where is this list, and how does it get updated? We're also going to ask, what about the third parties who are actually collecting this data? Now, government may be very sure that the data that they are storing is fully protected, but what about the ones who are collecting it? Have the issues there been plugged? So let's say good evening to Srinivas Kodali, researcher for Free Software Movement of India, and Prasanna S, advocate with the Supreme Court. Srinivas, let me start off with you. Can I share my photocopy of Aadhaar with any entity, and if so, which?
Well, I would say never share Aadhaar, even required when it's required. Find alternate IDs. But I think if one goes by the Supreme Court judgment, you can share Aadhaar when you need subsidy, and only for Aadhaar PAN card linkage. That's it. Anywhere else, I don't think there is a need for it. You have different other alternate IDs, if possible, if you can share your voter ID, your passport, your driver's license. And the primary reason I'm saying this is because if you share Aadhaar everywhere, you don't know how and who is going to misuse it, especially with the banking related frauds that we have seen with Aadhaar.
Okay, so you're saying that we should keep in mind that the Supreme Court tells us where we can and where we should not share it, and that's what we essentially could follow. Ideally not share it anywhere because there are so many concerns. Let me bring in Prasanna here as well. Prasanna, let's stick to what Supreme Court is telling. I'm not too sure if many are still following it, because everybody from all corporates to your societies and your clubhouses and your schools and everywhere else, people are still asking us and insisting on Aadhaar details.
Right. This is something that we had noticed even prior to the Supreme Court judgment, where in order to drive up adoption, at least in our studied view, it was actually a design that in order to drive up adoption, UIDAI and the Government of India encouraged people to rely on Aadhaar, and in many cases encouraged agencies to make Aadhaar mandatory. In fact, if you recall, 23rd of September 2013 was the first time the Supreme Court put some kind of brakes on Aadhaar and said, see, you cannot make it mandatory as so long as we are deciding on it. So subsequent to that, the Union of India filed an application before the Supreme Court asking for permission to be made mandatory so that adoption can be driven up, right? So this and that kind of that design kind of continued, and it continues to this day. And you see, that is why you have the left arm trying to caution people, say that, see, now we are seeing all these kind of frauds. Please do not indiscriminately give away your Aadhaar photocopies and all of that. That's actually a well-considered decision, well-considered statement that has been put out by the Bangalore Regional Center of the UIDAI. But there is also the right arm that also wants to do the other thing. So that is to say that no, Aadhaar is our flagship program. We want it to be adopted. We want it to be used everywhere. We want it to showcase to the world, saying that this is what we built. 1.3 billion Indians on it. We continue to use it. All these idea of all these news of fraud, etc. All of that are hyperbole, right? So that's the left arm not knowing the right arm, or the left arm trying to be in conflict with the right arm is what we are seeing.
A good intention, and
what
then
we see is that
bigger intention
the number of frauds.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so this kind of financial frauds in one way, but on another way, this normalization of making IDs mandatory, that itself began largely with Aadhaar. There are several places where 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you could walk in, you needn't use an ID. Right. You are there. If you, for example, there are many places where for an access, you are there as a person, you pay for that access, you get that access, be done with it. Right? This normalization of ID cards being made mandatory itself is also an Aadhaar phenomenon. Right? And because everybody has it, so now people do not have an excuse to not have it. So unless maybe like people like Srinivas and myself who have not enrolled for Aadhaar, there are very few people who are still who are holding out, right? So therefore, it's now normalized, and that is and what is and Supreme Court has said, privacy violations and privacy harms are not foreseeable, right? Which is why they said privacy had to be protected as a fundamental right. So if, for example, your photocopy is out today, the harm of that photocopy of your Aadhaar number being out today may not be felt tomorrow. It may not be felt 1 year later. It may be felt 5 years later.
Okay.
So what harm it will actually do is not foreseeable. Therefore, you need to take even more care in terms of whether you are sharing it, not sharing it. These decisions are not simple as to whether I'll be able to see the harms tomorrow or the day after.
So you and Srinivas, like you said, there are still a few out there who've not given in and gotten their Aadhaar done. But and I was having this social media conversation with Murli, another well-known lawyer, who said that why were people sharing it left, right, and center any which ways when it was very clear that you don't have to. Unless it's one of those mandatory institutions, you don't really have to. Why were you still doing it? And honestly, I am one of those people. To begin with, I always shared my driving license or my PAN card wherever there was a need where you couldn't get out of without giving an ID. But gradually I let my guard down, and today I'm feeling extremely sheepish about it to say, okay, this is still possible, this is perhaps still happening. Now, you mentioned multiple times, frauds that could take place. That's essentially what the warning is also about, the warning that now stands withdrawn. Possible misuse. Prasanna, I'll start with you. Can you help us understand, give some example of frauds that have happened, possible misuse because you submitted your photocopy somewhere?
So one certain misuse that has happened is indiscriminate accounts being opened in the name of Aadhaar. There are some stories that have come out on I think even the PM Kisan accounts that have been opened with Aadhaar numbers and Aadhaar photocopies that the beneficiaries don't seem to know about. So that's one. But I think Srinivas probably tracks much more closely in terms of the frauds and the latest news that is happening on that
Srinivas,
front.
If we see,
but that is one kind of fraud.
If we see, what we would look at is possibility of and we've seen reports of our details and Aadhaar copies themselves being published online. They're for everyone to see, my date of birth, my address, everything right there online. Then the possibility that Prasanna is talking also about of somebody else using that ID for their purpose, whether it's buying a mobile phone or a SIM card or any other larger transaction that they want to do. Then of course is the highest level perhaps, which should be stealing my biometric data if that level of breach happens. So help us put it in perspective. What's the possible misuse that we are trying to prevent here?
Well, there are various kinds of Aadhaar related fraud, but fundamental fraud that you would see is identity theft. Because it's an ID card, anything related to identity theft is a start. Now, once someone has your Aadhaar details, where all can they use it? Because you can use your Aadhaar in a host of contexts to book a hotel ID. So if I'm a criminal and I don't want someone to know that I'm staying at a particular place, I can forge the ID card details, use your details, but put my photo, right? Still book a hotel, still fly, still use trains. So identity theft is one level of fraud. Then we have banking related frauds. Because you use KYC for banking and Aadhaar has become the de facto KYC, anyone can open bank accounts under your name, do some of these DBT related frauds, which Prasanna just mentioned, where I can give your Aadhaar number details to a bank account that I control, I have opened under your name, and withdraw DBT for various government schemes under your name. It's fraud. It's being done under your name. If anybody wants to investigate, it will likely point to you. But then there is the other kind of personal financial fraud, where when you link your bank account to an Aadhaar, because one can withdraw money through Aadhaar-based payment systems. You have Aadhaar-enabled payment systems, APS, where one can just give their fingerprints and withdraw money. But when you do give fingerprints in case of Aadhaar for authentication, you don't know how they are going to be used. So when people go queue up for ration and they're giving out their fingerprints, they really don't know if their fingerprints are being used to withdraw ration or it's being used to withdraw money from their bank accounts, because one does not get any kind of notifications from UIDAI where the transaction was carried out. And there is a reason for this. If the UIDAI does know where all it's happening, it can lead to surveillance. So they said, we don't want to know where transactions happen. And because of this, they're blinded to the transactions that happen, and you also don't know where the transactions happen, leading to financial frauds. So there are structural issues within the design of Aadhaar, which the team at UIDAI never really considered. All the Aadhaar volunteers who claimed to make a perfect design suddenly started bringing the idea of masked Aadhaar when people pointed out the people is me here, but we pointed out that 130 million Aadhaar numbers were in the public domain. That's the reason the whole idea of masked Aadhaar actually came in. Now, 5 years after this was pointed out, I believe it's the regulatory arm of UIDAI. Now, UIDAI is also a regulator after the 2019 amendment to the Aadhaar Act, which is saying, you know what, it can be misused, so don't give it everywhere. So the two functions of UIDAI, one is to promote Aadhaar as an identity, the other is to regulate Aadhaar. And I believe this happened because of the recent CAG report, where the CAG criticized the UIDAI of its functions and what it has been doing, and not stopping a certain kind of fraud and certain kind of duplicate Aadhaar numbers that were created. And I believe there is one arm within the UIDAI which was trying to at least warn people of how to make themselves safe, and now you have the other arm which is like, oh, you know what, nothing's wrong with Aadhaar.
Yeah, because I mean, and let me look at a list of the kind of responses we've usually got when concerns have been raised by people like you. UIDAI will always say there is no breach or leakage of Aadhaar data from our database, and they always emphasize on from our servers or our database there has been no compromise. They've gone to the extent of saying just merely displaying your Aadhaar number is not going to serve any purpose. It doesn't mean any data breach has taken place, because your biometrics are what are essential and they are with us. Anybody who wants to use your Aadhaar number will have to check with us to verify it, and that's where the alert comes into the system. This is explained in multiple language ways which most people actually don't understand, but essentially saying this. They've also said that any Aadhaar linked transaction is processed after successful authentication of fingerprint and iris of the individual. The fastest computers on earth would take the age of the universe to crack Aadhaar's encryption key. So that's the extent to which they have gone to say, to allay people's fears. And then comes this circular which says, wait, it can be misused, so be very, very careful of what you're sharing and where you're sharing. Srinivas, then let's talk about masked Aadhaar. Because the government in that advisory also said you can go and download masked Aadhaar from the website and use that if you really have to. How does that help?
I mean, see, if you're using masked Aadhaar, essentially you're not sharing your 12-digit number, right? So your Aadhaar number is your user ID, your fingerprints are your passwords. Now, what the UIDAI is saying is, you know what, your passwords are safe with us. So to do any fraud, I would need the username and the password. So if you're sharing your Aadhaar numbers without masking it, then your usernames are public. Your fingerprints are sometimes public, so you're not just giving it to the UIDAI. You give your fingerprints to Passport Authority, you're giving it to your driver license issuing authority, you're using it when you're registering land. So there have been enough incidents related to land databases being breached in Telangana, in Haryana, where fingerprints were stolen from land databases, and Aadhaar numbers, because they were public, people could use Aadhaar numbers and the fingerprints to withdraw money using APS APIs. So this idea that your fingerprints are not public and are protected solely by UIDAI is flawed to begin with. So now the only way one can protect themselves, because their passwords are public, is to protect their usernames, which is the Aadhaar numbers. So the only way you can protect yourself is to not to share your Aadhaar number. If nobody has your Aadhaar number, you're less likely to be prone to a fraud.
Okay. So on the screens as Srinivas was talking is that distinction. So masked Aadhaar doesn't mean that they put a mask on your photo or they take your photo away from it. It essentially means that the number is not fully visible, just like how it is in several high security banking transactions. So your account number is never completely visible in the messages that you get. Now, how do you get this? You will have to go to the Aadhaar website. So myAadhaar.uidai.gov.in. So go to this website, enter your Aadhaar card number. There will be again a verification process. You'll get an OTP once you've logged in. Then you go to the option, do you want a masked Aadhaar? Select download, and that's how you get a copy of your masked Aadhaar. Outside of this, do not access, as the initial advisory said, your Aadhaar details on a public computer. And if you do, because you need to download it and you don't have a personal computer access, then ensure that you delete it and erase it from that local server. That was the part of the advisory and warning that was issued, that now stands withdrawn, but experts will tell you that's perhaps still a good thing to follow. So let's come back to rules and regulations to make it more secure, Prasanna. Where do we stand on that? The big battle about Aadhaar went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court gave its verdict on what's okay and what's not okay, where it can be made mandatory or not mandatory at all. Yet the security concerns remain. Where do we stand on it today, now in 2022?
Right. I think it will be, if we want, let's assume that for the moment that the system is going to stay, right? And if we want it to stay, the only way it remains secure is by limiting its use. Right? If the moment it is put to use for widespread and for purposes it was completely not contemplated under, or certainly purposes not sanctioned by the Supreme Court, let's keep it that way. So for this kind of indiscriminate use and the expansion of use will have a problem of frauds and attempted frauds being also being far too many than what we can handle. Right. So the first way is to try and find a way to limit its use, and that is what the Supreme Court did. In fact, it said you can't use it for children, you can't use it for pensions, you can't use it for this, you can't use it for that. Of course, one of the reasons they said the Aadhaar Act does not authorize you to do it. But if there is also another significant part of the discussion where several problems have been highlighted in terms of the system and in terms of when this system is being put to use. If those fears have to be allayed, it said limiting its use. And so therefore, all our rules, regulations, if we are discussing rules and regulations, they will need to be channeled towards limiting Aadhaar's use. If there are 5 or 6 uses that have been sanctioned by the Supreme Court, let us try and keep it only to that and nothing more. And within that, even within the uses that have been sanctioned by the Supreme Court, we see other problems, right? Includes exclusions, in terms of frauds, because the PDS fraud, the Surat PDF fraud, if you remember 2.5 years ago, where fingerprints molds were designed and then grains were pilfered from an Aadhaar-based authentication system. So even within the sanctioned purposes, we see frauds happening. If that is the case, forget about expanding its use to other non-sanctioned uses. Try and see how we can make it even within make it secure even within those sanctioned purposes, and that includes PDS, and where we see a lot of trouble right now in terms of both exclusionary errors as well as frauds.
Yes, and both, despite the fact that have been spoken about so much, reported on so much, they continue to be extremely big issues. Now, the other aspect, which was there in the warning that's been withdrawn, but I feel we must talk about, is the fact that you need to check whether the organization that's asking you for this detail has a user license. What does that mean, Srinivas, and how do I check whether my bank or my payment gateway portal or my airline has that license?
I think so. When they designed the whole Aadhaar framework, they gave a bunch of licenses to a couple of businesses.
Yeah.
There were the Aadhaar service agencies, ASAs, who would be essentially API providers for the Aadhaar API. And then there are Aadhaar user authentication agencies, AUAs, who can access Aadhaar APIs through these ASAs. Now, anybody can apply for this license. That doesn't mean one gets it. Like a bank can apply, a government body, like the Hyderabad police has a AUA license because they use Aadhaar for biometric attendance, which they're supposed to stop after the judgment. I don't think anybody has stopped the Aadhaar-based attendance attendance usage. But anybody can get a AUA license from the UIDAI. One has to apply to it. But you don't know who these people are. UIDAI is not publishing that list. There have been a couple of parliamentary questions inside the parliament asking, tell us who these Aadhaar service agencies are, Aadhaar user agencies are. And UIDAI did not reply to these questions inside the parliament. Forget to the common man. The UIDAI did not tell the parliamentarians the list of these agencies who are authorized to collect Aadhaar. Now, there is no such thing where you will know who is an authorized entity as such, unless you're someone who can show a license from the UIDAI saying, you know what, I have this license, which most entities don't show. So the only option you have right now is to only use Aadhaar, give Aadhaar to government, because the way it was designed was for an individual to authenticate themselves with the government for government programs. There was this section 57 in the Aadhaar Act of 2016, which allowed private sector to use Aadhaar. But that section has been struck down by the court. The private sector can't demand access to Aadhaar APIs. Section 57 was removed. So the only way the current private sector can access Aadhaar is if it's related to subsidies. So there are a bunch of these banks and fintech firms who are still seeking Aadhaar under PMLA and under DBT subsidy withdrawal for DBT. So they are claiming they are authorized to do it by narrowly reading the Supreme Court judgment. But I think UIDAI has given some sort of licenses to them as well.
Yes.
But otherwise, we really don't know who these authorized entities are.
So government notified about 38 entities. When I was researching for this to see, where do you find this list? And it was a list that gets updated. I did find news reports that said that the government had notified 38 of these entities, which are largely financial entities, NBFCs, and other payment transaction entities who've got the KYC user agency license. But is that the same or that's separate? And you are saying essentially there is no updated list available online. So how is a person supposed to verify if the organization has a user license?
I think the organization has to show that license.
Okay.
So if you're at a hotel establishment, they usually get a license from the public health official that they are a licensed entity which is adhering to the public health licenses of the public health code of the municipality. Similarly, with the UIDAI, if these organizations have a license, I think people can demand this and they will have to show it.
Okay. In fact, Prasanna, my last question to you before we wrap this up, that warning that was withdrawn, and I have to repeatedly emphasize on it, even though, on the face of it, everything which is there definitely does merit a look and a conversation and a warning to people. It also said unlicensed private entities like hotels or film halls are not permitted to collect and keep copies. It is an offense under the Aadhaar Act 2016. If they ask for your Aadhaar details, they actually can be punished for that. Tell us a little bit more about this, because I think people who want to take a stand and refuse, sharing their Aadhaar with such private entities need to know about this law.
That's correct. It is punishable under the law, under section 37, if I remember correctly. So as Srinivas actually highlighted an important point, right? So Section 57 of the Aadhaar Act was struck down by the Supreme Court. And Section 57 was not only struck down to the extent that the private sectors make it mandatory for getting Aadhaar, but even to the extent that private sector can collect Aadhaar voluntarily. Section 57 was struck down. To say that, see, if we allow them to collect voluntarily, we will not have the mechanism in place to check misuse anyway. And then the temptation for commercial exploitation of this data, which is legitimately collected only for state purposes, the temptation would be too high and that cannot be allowed. Which is why even voluntary use of Aadhaar by private entities was struck down. So say because Section 57, to the extent they are applied to private sector, was fully struck down. So as Srinivas pointed out, so if it is for private sector, then it means it must only have some kind of state purpose.
Right.
If, for example, there are states under which, to get access to a hotel, I think the state home ministries would have issued notification saying you cannot avail of hotel facilities unless you prove you furnished your ID respectively. If there is a specific order to that effect and say that you may provide any of your ID card copies, including Aadhaar, so then you can go ahead and provide. So because there is but even then, assuming that order is still subject to judicial challenge and all of that. So because that even there, whether that can be allowed, whether those state notifications can allow for Aadhaar photocopies to be collected, that's secondary. But the moment they can show you some kind of a government notification, at least that one check that can be performed by every citizen is there a government notification that is backing this, that allows these entities to collect the Aadhaar details. So one is the way to, whether they have a license from the UIDAI is one way to do it, but that license is largely only to connect up to the UIDAI servers to do the online authentication. Otherwise, there is no license. In fact, all of these hotels that collect copies of your ID cards, etc., they don't have license.
Yeah.
They don't have, because they're never going to do online authentication with the UIDAI servers. Right? So they are likely collecting it under some kind of a government notification. If you don't have a license, at least you ask for a government notification where at least the state entity that is going to be responsible if there is a violation of your
okay,
rights,
which also at the end of the day should not be there, but there may be certain government orders again to promote the use of Aadhaar ID, they possibly issued that, which shouldn't be there. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me. Really, I think this was a good refresher course for everybody to remember what happened in the run up to the Supreme Court verdict, all the issues that did come about and did get discussed, to remember that even now there are instances of all kinds of frauds, essentially from simply using a photocopy of an Aadhaar to all the way up to your biometrics, identity theft. There are many examples of these that have been reported in the last few years. So remember only to share your Aadhaar details when it comes to certain government entities, whether it's for welfare schemes and other such purposes, PDS being one of those examples. Otherwise, you don't need to. There are some now entities which have been given the permission largely about your financial transactions, where also immediately if they are going to use that Aadhaar number to verify your ID, you will get an alert from UIDAI that such and such entity is actually trying to verify your ID. So you should know that. Otherwise, use the masked version. That's the best way. That's what experts are telling us. Don't give out your full 12-digit Aadhaar number to anybody. Just use the masked version. This is what the circular that now stands withdrawn said. The idea and the intent of that warning to the public was actually in the right direction. Perhaps because of the panic it was causing, the outrage that it was causing, and embarrassment that it would have caused the government and the Aadhaar authority, they have decided to withdraw those. But the concerns still remain. So be very clear and selective in where you use and share your Aadhaar information. In fact, if you are concerned on whether or not it has already been misused, again, you can go back to your to the UIDAI website, log in and check. That information is also there, not just to download your Mass Aadhaar, but also you can check which are the organizations who've actually used it to verify your ID. And if you see some organization where you didn't share your Aadhaar data, then there possibly could be an indication of possible misuse. So do look at that as well. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Simplified. Thank you so much for joining us.